We're back to the Neil Haley Show, and I'm excited to welcome the program author Andrew Reynolds. He is a podcast executive producer for this ESPN 30 for 30 new podcast about America's first ice hockey star, and it's narrated by David Duchovny. How are you, Andrew? It's got to be. We're going to talk about searching for Hobey Baker. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, it's great. Thank you so much.
Let's talk about this. When you talk about how did this all come about to go back and highlight Hobey Baker?
So I didn't know too much about Hobey Baker. As you can probably tell from my accent, I started life in England, but was a professor in the States for a long time, Notre Dame, and then 20 years at the University of North Carolina. But in 2020, I moved to Princeton, and Hobey Baker is legendary at Princeton. He was in the bricks and the mortar of every building. He's the huge star. And one of my friends came to me, and he'd grown up in Princeton, and he said, you know, there's been a lot being written about Hobey Baker. He has a legendary story. It's sort of The Natural and The Great Gatsby and Chariots of Fire all rolled into one. But he said, I don't really think that we know the full picture. I don't think we know the layers of this man. And so we spent the last 4 years just delving into everything we could to sort of investigate who is this real person, not just the trophy that is given to the best collegiate hockey player every year, but who is the real Hobey Baker? And so that's how it came about. And it's been a fascinating adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like a fascinating adventure you're talking about because, people need to learn this specific about this America's first ice hockey star. Why title it America's first ice hockey star?
Well, he started playing hockey at St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, which was the cradle of hockey. And Hobey was literally one of the first Americans to get hold of real sticks and real pucks from Canada. And at St. Paul's, they had ponds that would freeze for 3-4 months of the year, not anymore, sadly, with climate change. But he would play and just be remarkably good. I mean, his prep school team beat the Ivy League teams in his final year at prep school, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. And he was this iconic hockey player at Princeton. He was so good that his team beat the Canadians for the first time in Montreal. And the Canadians actually offered him money after college to be a professional hockey player. And they'd said, we've never seen an American who can play hockey like Hobey Baker.
Wow. And I kind of want to go that backstory. We're going to go into further why this podcast, why the intriguing portions of this is we're going to go into the story of Hobey Baker. But when you think about specifically enough, what most hockey players did not, the U.S. base was not having many hockey players at all. It was more Canadians and other countries then, it sounds like, at that time.
Yeah, I mean, hockey is obviously bigger in Canada at the time, but Hobey Baker and his teams are the first ones to really be able to take on the Canadians. And it is pretty popular. If you get to the sort of 1910s to 14 college period that Hobey played, then hockey is front page news. Boston Globe and the New York Times, Hobey and the rest of the Princeton team play here tonight. He was like the Tom Brady, the Michael Jordan of the time, always front page news, the biggest celebrity athlete. And it was also sort of the thing to be seen going to do. It was like going to the opera. St. Nick's Rink, which is on 66th West in Manhattan, it's no longer there now. People would go, high society Americans and New Yorkers would go dressed up in their tuxedos and their ball gowns to watch Hobey play. It was like going to the opera.
Oh, wow. And when you uncovered more about Hobey Baker, that's what really inspired you to know growing up in that time, playing hockey, and kind of go into the backstory for Hobey now.
Yeah, so Hobey was such a celebrity that in many ways, the sort of legend and the articles have focused on his athletic achievements and also on his war achievements, because we'll get on to the fact that he was a First World War fighter pilot as well. But the reality is that when we looked into his relationships, when we looked into his letters, when we looked into the memories, and we spent a lot of time doing, I think, a really diligent job of collecting everything we could, we found that it had been overlooked or perhaps swept under the carpet that Hobey was a gay man. Hobey was in a very deep relationship with Percy Rivington Pine, one of the most wealthy people in America at the time. Hobey was friends with the Vanderbilts, with the Astors, with Cole Porter, with Woodrow Wilson, sort of iconically attached to all these great American celebrities. But Hobey at the time of 1910 to 1917 was, clearly in a relationship, was a gay man. And of course, if you know anything about hockey today, there have been thousands of professional NHL players since its establishment in the 1920s, but the league has never had an out gay or bisexual player. And a lot of kids playing hockey today who happen to be gay don't feel it's really a sport for them because they find it quite difficult to navigate the locker rooms and how the sport treats them. So it's a very modern story. It's 120 years old, but it's a story about a man who was revered, but we didn't really see all of who he was.
I mean, I am shocked you talked about that time period. That's intriguing for the podcast and how he did deal with that during that time period, right? I mean, especially with all as a celebrity, a gay man celebrity in the 1900s, in that early 1900s. That must have been challenging for him and playing hockey at the same time.
Well, it's interesting to me because I wasn't aware of the fact, and I think a lot of your listeners won't be aware of the fact, that the space for men to be in relationships with men was actually quite large before the First World War. It was sort of a bit of a don't ask, don't tell situation where it wasn't really perceived to be that bad as long as you didn't make a big song and dance over it. So before the 1920s, they were sort of in a glass closet. Everybody knew, it was accepted in different levels of society. Men didn't really see themselves as gay or straight. They just saw themselves as men who loved men and maybe loved women as well. So there wasn't that sort of box that the world has put people into today. If anything, Hobey's real struggles were the classic struggles of a sportsman who has lost his height of fame. Roger Federer's coach, I saw recently say that a great athlete dies twice. They die when they die, but they also die when they leave the top of their game, the top of their sports. And I think that's what Hobey struggled with more than anything. After Princeton and playing amateur hockey for a few years after Princeton, he was left wondering what he was going to do for the rest of his life. He was no longer the iconic, beautiful athlete that he was. He was, getting older and he was struggling with this, what do I do next in my life?
The one question I have is why didn't he play in the NHL before we leave off on this?
So the NHL wasn't established until after his death, a few years after his death. But he was offered $20,000 to play professionally in Canada, in Montreal. And he was incredibly loyal to this idea of amateurism. He had this idea from England, in effect, that the true athletes were amateur athletes. And if you were paid for the sport, it completely tainted your pure athletic performance. So he never would accept any payment for playing the sport, and he never considered playing the sport, even though he could have done it very easily after his college days.
Okay, so ESPN's 30 for 30 new podcast, Searching for Hobey Baker, is available on all different podcast networks. Appreciate it again, Andrew. What a fascinating story. People need to listen to the podcast. Thanks again for stopping by.
Thanks so much, Neil.
You're listening and watching The Neil Haley Show, and we'll be back in just a moment.